All right, strap in for this one because uh, today we're diving deep into the trenches of World War One.
Literally into the trenches.
Yeah, literally into the trenches. To a story so unbelievable, it sounds like it's ripped straight from a horror movie script.
I mean, even for World War One, it's pretty incredible.
Picture this. Soldiers seemingly brought back from death, rising to fight back against the enemy.
It sounds like a zombie movie.
Right. But this is no zombie flick, though. This is the true story of the attack of the dead men at Osowiec Fortress back in 1915.
Yeah, it's an absolutely gripping story, and even more fascinating when you consider the historical context.
Exactly.
We're talking 1915. The horrors of trench warfare were in full swing at this point. And then you have the terrifying introduction of all these new technologies, poison gas, for example.
Right. Weapons no one had ever seen before.
Right. Osowiec Fortress, which, by the way, is in what's now northeastern Poland, was a key stronghold for Russia, if the Germans could capture it. Huge strategic victory.
So both sides knew Osowiec was important. This wasn't just some random outpost. And this leads us up to that fateful day, August 6, 1915. The Germans launched a massive chlorine gas attack on the fortress.
Can you imagine that? This thick greenish cloud of chlorine gas just engulfing the entire Russian defense.
It's a horrifying thought. And chlorine gas is heavier than air,
Yeah.
right? So it would have settled right down into those trenches.
Exactly. And the effects on the Russian soldiers, immediate and absolutely horrific.
Just awful.
We're talking burning eyes, scorched throats, intense chest pain. Many died agonizing deaths just from the gas itself.
It's hard to even imagine that level of suffering. And I know this is where the whole dead men part of the story comes in. But before we get there, can you talk a little bit more about like the thinking behind using poison gas? Was this a common tactic at this point in the war?
Well, poison gas was a relatively new weapon in 1915.
I mean, World War I was the first time it was used on a large scale, right?
Exactly. And the use of it at Osowiec was one of the first large-scale gas attacks in history. So the Germans, they were hoping to use it to completely incapacitate the Russian defenders. Basically, they thought it would just clear the way for an easy victory.
Right. Makes sense. Just walk right in and take over.
Exactly. But what they didn't count on was the incredible resilience of those defending the fortress.
Okay, so the stage is set. You have the Germans launching this devastating gas attack, expecting to just stroll into an empty, defenseless fortress.
Yeah, ripe for the taking.
But what they encountered was something far more terrifying, something they never could have anticipated.
As the gas started to dissipate the German troops, they cautiously advanced towards the fortress.
They probably thought everyone was dead.
Exactly. But then what they saw emerging from this haze, well, it chilled them to the bone. I mean, just absolutely terrified them.
I bet. What did they see?
Russian soldiers. Their uniforms were in tatters, their faces contorted in pain. Many of them were coughing up blood.
Oh my.
Some of them were even coughing up pieces of their lungs.
They were still alive? After all that exposure to chlorine gas.
Yeah, but barely. I mean, these were men who had truly been pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. They looked like the walking dead, barely able to stand, let alone fight.
So this is where that whole dead men legend comes from, right? I mean, obviously, they weren't actually zombies.
No, of course not.
But I can see why the Germans might have thought that.
Oh, absolutely. The term dead men perfectly reflects the sheer terror those German soldiers must have felt. Seeing these figures just kind of emerge from that cloud of gas, they must have felt like they were looking at an army of the undead.
I can't even imagine. That is a truly terrifying image. It really shows you the profound psychological impact this whole new type of warfare had on people. So the Germans see these figures, these dead men. What happened next?
Well, driven by this incredible sense of desperation and defiance, the remaining Russian soldiers launched a counterattack.
But they were still able to fight.
Yes. Despite their horrific injuries, they charged. It was this chaotic, frenzied charge straight at the German lines. Imagine the shock, the absolute terror of the German troops who fully anticipated an easy victory. And then suddenly they're facing these seemingly invincible figure.
I can only imagine. It sounds like something straight out of a nightmare. A horror movie playing out right there in the trenches. Did the Russians have any real chance of winning at this point? I mean, they were severely outnumbered and injured, weren't they?
I mean, on paper, no. Their chances of success were slim to none.
Right. Makes sense.
But what they did have going for them was the element of surprise and the sheer psychological impact of their appearance. I mean, they were no longer men in the eyes of the Germans. They were phantoms, specters of death
And
itself.
they were charging straight at the German lines. So did the Germans panic.
Oh, absolutely. The psychological impact of that counterattack was just overwhelming. The Germans, who again were anticipating this easy victory, they completely broke ranks and retreated in pure terror. I mean, they were running from what they perceived to be an army of the undead. I mean, it really is a remarkable turn of events when you think about it. A handful of severely injured, poisoned soldiers managed to drive back this much larger, much better equipped force.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
It really speaks volumes, though, about the power of human resilience, you know?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But also about just the sheer terror that war, especially this new kind of chemical warfare, could inflict.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned that this was one of the first large-scale uses of poison gas.
Yeah, one of the very first.
Did this event, this attack of the dead men, did it have any lasting impact on the way that gas was used in warfare?
It definitely, without a doubt, brought the horrors of gas warfare into sharp focus.
I can see that.
While both sides continued to use gas throughout the war, Osoik served as this kind of stark warning about its unpredictable and just absolutely terrifying effects.
Like a wake-up call.
Exactly. And it raised all these really complex questions about the ethics of using such weapons.
It's a good point. These new advancements in warfare, they often come with these unintended consequences and, like you said, these ethical dilemmas that are really hard to resolve. So this event, obviously, it had a huge impact at the time. But what about its lasting legacy? I mean, how has this story evolved over the years?
That's where it gets really interesting. The attack of the dead men kind of occupies this fascinating space between, like, history and legend.
Okay, we can see that.
While there's no doubt that the attack happened and that those Russian soldiers displayed incredible courage, the event itself, it's been, well, amplified in its retelling over the years.
So some embellishment, some, like, dramatic license has been taken.
Exactly. But that's often how legends are born, right? You have this kernel of truth that gets amplified and shaped over time.
Totally. I mean, look at any, like, ancient myth or legend. There's always a grain of truth in there somewhere.
Right. And in a way, that makes the story even more fascinating because it kind of reveals how we as humans grapple with the horrors of war and try to find meaning in the chaos. The attack of the dead men becomes this powerful symbol of defiance against, like, well, insurmountable odds. It's inspiring in a way.
I get that. It's like, yeah, the underdog story, the triumph of the human spirit. I'm curious, though, do we have any firsthand accounts from the soldiers who participated in that counterattack? What did they say about that day?
Well, there are some accounts from Russian soldiers who survived the gas attack and participated in the counterattack, but they're, well, fragmented, and they often focus on the immediate experience of the gas and the chaotic nature of the fighting.
I mean, it makes sense.
It was such an overwhelming, such a surreal event. I mean, it's understandable that clear, detailed accounts are hard to come by.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine trying to process what they had just experienced. It would be almost impossible to put into words. So the legend has grown over time. But what about its historical significance? How has this event been viewed by historians?
Historians generally acknowledge the attack of the dead men as this testament to the tenacity of those Russian soldiers at Osijek.
Okay, so they agree that it was a significant event.
They do. However, they also caution against over-romanticizing the event, you know? It's important to remember that these were real men who suffered tremendously, not like invincible super soldiers.
Right, we can't lose sight of the human cost amid all the drama of the legend. Did this event have any impact on the overall course of World War I? Or was it more of a symbolic victory?
While the counterattack at Osijek didn't directly alter the course of the war, it did have symbolic value, especially for the Russians.
Okay, how so?
Well, it boosted their morale, of course, and it contributed to the fortress's enduring reputation as the symbol of resistance.
Makes sense. But didn't the Germans eventually capture Osijek?
They did a few months later, but not through force.
Really? How did they take it then?
The Russians, they were facing this renewed German offensive, so they made the strategic decision to withdraw, and they destroyed the fortress as they left.
Wow. So in a way, the legend of the dead men kind of overshadowed the eventual fall of the fortress.
You could say that. It's a reminder that sometimes the stories we tell about war can be more powerful than the actual strategic outcomes.
And speaking of stories, I'm curious about how this event was used in propaganda. Did either side try to capitalize on the legend of the dead men for their own purposes?
Oh, absolutely. Both sides used the event for propaganda
I
purposes.
figured they would. How so?
Well, the Russians, they portrayed it as this testament to their soldiers' unwavering courage and determination. While the Germans, they initially downplayed the event, but later they actually used it to reinforce this image of the Russian soldier as this, relentless, almost inhuman enemy.
Interesting. So they both kind of spun it to fit their own narrative.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how the same event can be framed in completely different ways to suit different narratives, and it highlights the power of propaganda in shaping public perception of war.
For sure. Because back then, there was no internet, no social media. People got their news from newspapers and, official government statements. So propaganda was a very powerful tool.
Absolutely. The attack of the dead men became this powerful tool for shaping morale, instilling fear, and ultimately furthering the war effort on both sides. It's a reminder that war is not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the realm of information and perception.
So we've talked about the historical context, the attack itself, how the story has evolved over time, its use in propaganda. Is there anything else about this event that you find particularly intriguing or that you think our listeners should consider?
What I find particularly fascinating is the way this event blurs the lines between history and myth. We have documented evidence of the attack itself, German records, Russian accounts, but then there's this layer of myth-making that's built upon it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
You're saying that even if the legend has been, well, embellished a bit, it still holds value.
Yeah. It speaks to this deeper human need to find meaning in the face of tragedy, to celebrate courage and resilience even in the darkest of circumstances. The attack of the dead men might not be entirely accurate in all its details, but the spirit of it, the core message of human defiance, remains incredibly powerful.
It's like a testament to the indomitable human spirit,
Mm.
the will to survive and resist, even against, seemingly impossible odds. But it's important to remember, as you said earlier, that these weren't invincible zombies. They were real people who endured unimaginable suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the legend is captivating, no doubt.
Oh, for sure.
But we can't, lose sight of the horrific reality of what those soldiers actually went through.
Right.
The chlorine gas attack, it was a war crime, plain and simple.
Yeah.
And the injuries sustained by those who survived, devastating. Many of them continue to suffer from, respiratory problems
I bet.
and other long-term health issues for the rest of their lives.
It's a sobering thought. It's a reminder that, behind every legend, every heroic tale of war, there are real people who suffered and died. It makes you wonder about the psychological toll on the German soldiers as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, can you imagine to see these figures emerge from that gas cloud, to be driven back by what they perceived as the undead?
Yeah.
That must have left some lasting scars.
There's no doubt that the psychological impact on the German soldiers was significant.
I mean, how could it not be?
The event was so unexpected.
Right. Totally outside the realm of anything they'd ever experienced.
Exactly. It must have completely shaken their sense of reality.
I can see that. Like almost an existential crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it challenged their understanding of life and death, of what it meant to face an enemy who seemed to defy both.
This brings us back to that idea of history versus legend. How much of the German retreat was due to actual fear of these quote-unquote undead soldiers?
Right.
And how much was due to, maybe more practical concerns like the unexpected resistance disrupting their plans?
It's impossible to know for sure what was going through the minds of those German soldiers. Likely, it was a combination of factors.
I mean, that makes sense.
The unexpected resistance,
Right.
the sheer shock of seeing those figures emerge from the gas,
Yeah.
the disruption of their carefully laid plans.
It all adds up.
All of these things probably would have contributed to their decision to retreat, but the legend of the dead men, that adds another layer to the story.
Okay, what do you mean?
It speaks to this deeper, almost primal fear, the fear of the unknown, of that which defies our understanding of the natural order.
So the legend itself, even if it's exaggerated, it becomes a kind of psychological weapon,
Exactly.
adding to the terror and uncertainty of war.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that war is not only fought on the physical battlefield, but also in the minds of the soldiers involved. The attack of the dead men, it becomes this powerful symbol of the psychological impact of war, the way it can distort our perceptions and push us to the absolute limits of our endurance.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the attack of the dead men, what's the one key takeaway you would leave our listener with?
I think the important thing is to remember that history is rarely black and white.
Yeah, good point.
It's filled with shades of gray, with these incredible acts of heroism alongside, just unimaginable brutality. The Attack of the Dead Men, I think it really encapsulates this duality perfectly. It's a story of courage, resilience, but it's also this stark reminder of the dehumanizing effects of war, the way it can twist our perceptions, push us to the very edge of what we believe is possible.
It's a story that definitely stays with you. And for our listener, if this deep dive has piqued your interest, I encourage you to, delve a little deeper. Check out the history of Osowick Fortress, World War I, and all those countless other stories of bravery, resilience, and sacrifice that often get overshadowed by, the grand narratives of war.
And remember, every war, every battle, every historical event, it's made up of individual human stories. And it's through those stories, those individual perspectives, that we can truly understand the impact of these events, the cost of conflict, the enduring power of the human spirit.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of World War I. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.